Funding for this program was provided by the law firm of McDonald, Illig, Jones, and Britton.
It's late March on Lake Erie, and winter's icy grip has barely given way to spring's thaw. Still draped in her winter cocoon, a tall ship patiently waits to emerge from her slumber. Her majestic masts lowered and decks cleared after transport to the East Coast, she slowly awakens to the voices of crew and the cadence of shipwright's tools. The annual ritual of refitting has begun. The acrid scent of steaming pitch mingles with the sweet aromas of wood, oils, varnish, and hemp as the crew works feverishly to restore their ship to Bristol condition. Soon, the cleaned and oiled spars are readied and carefully stepped into position. A silver coin is placed beneath the mast, an ancient maritime tradition stemming from Greek mythology to ensure safe passage to all who board. Her masts in place, the crew sets about the complex task of rigging. Miles of line, each with its own special purpose and name, tie the ship together in a complex, symmetrical web. Finally, her massive sails are hauled aloft and secured under the exacting eye of the captain. At last, the moment arrives. This elegant wooden ship is freed from her moorings and slowly eased from the slip. And then, as if touched by magic, this great mass of wood, iron, rope, and canvas is transformed into a stunning object of incomparable grace and beauty. As breathtaking as she is under sail, this square rigger was not designed for aesthetics. She was made for war. The War of 1812. And she is one of only 2 naval vessels interpreting that era. Built in Erie, Pennsylvania, the US Brig Niagara blazed her own chapter in American history during the Battle of Lake Erie nearly 200 years ago. Today's Niagara carries a message, not of war, but of goodwill, sailing as an ambassador of the Commonwealth and the official flagship of Pennsylvania.
Well, topsail, keep going, main brace.
Each summer, the Niagara and her crew of professionals and volunteers set sail for ports, small and large, many steeped in a common history of American spirit and determination. This is the story of one such journey and the valiant legacy of Niagara, her officers and crew, past and present, as they bring to life romance, adventure, and history in the days of sail. Those who witness the sight of a tall ship under sail almost immediately fall under the spell of her beauty. Writers throughout the ages have found inspiration and struggled for words to capture its essence. Author R.H. Dana perhaps said it best when he wrote, "There are very few who have ever seen a ship, literally, under all her sail. Then, with all her sails light and heavy and studding, sails on each side, alow and aloft, she is the most glorious moving object in the world. At the start of her sail, this time to East Coast ports, Niagara moves proudly through the Atlantic Ocean. She is the tallest of tall ships from the Great Lakes, her masts soaring more than 100 feet skyward. At a distance, her graceful motion seems almost effortless. But inside this wooden world resides a crew of 40, half professional and half volunteer, controlling her every move. During the sailing season, the US Brig Niagara is a self-contained community guided by the captain and ship's officers. A carpenter, an engineer, a boatswain, a sailmaker, a cook, and plenty of deckhands painstakingly attend to the needs of both ship and sailor. Skills of traditional seamanship are passed on from the experienced hands to the volunteers, who join the crew often with little or no experience. Their apprenticeship is grueling, but critical to the safety of the ship and all aboard. The romance and adventure of sailing is often far from the reality of everyday life aboard Niagara. Daylight hours are laced with rigorous work, the nights spent in hammocks just inches from shipmates. Meals are simple, the watch constant, day after day, night after night, through fair weather and foul. By today's standards, a sailing ship is an inefficient mode of transportation. But in another place and time, when our country was in its youth, at the dawn of the 19th century, the great ships ruled.
The seas have always been the major highways of international commerce, and the Great Lakes are the inland seas of this continent. The water routes were the deepest, fastest penetration into the continent in a roadless wilderness. The only efficient way to move large quantities of men and supplies was by water.
The Great Lakes were major trading routes used by the United States and Canada, but these lakes were separated from the Atlantic and each other by perilous falls and rapids. The isolation of this region required lake vessels to be built on site, along the shores of their home waters. Ships that controlled the lake territories possessed a tremendous military advantage during times of war. In 1812, Great Britain ruled the upper Great Lakes. But the power of the Royal Navy was challenged from the southern shore of Lake Erie, where an American squadron was under construction. This would later prove to be a critical disadvantage for the British. Some things never change, like Washington, D.C., the pinnacle of power both in 1800 and today. Niagara visits the historic Washington Navy Yard. In the early 19th century, it rapidly expanded as a shipbuilding center. In 1814, when the British captured Washington, the yard's commandant ordered it burned to the ground to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. On a summer day in June, the flagship docks at the capital city and plays host to decision-makers with her goodwill message. At an on-board reception, Governor Tom Ridge of Pennsylvania mixes with politicians, foreign diplomats, and naval officers, offering a history lesson on Niagara, her mission, and her future.
The Brig Niagara is very much a part of the state's history and the country's history, and we intend on using it not only this year but in future years as a goodwill ambassador to talk about trade with foreign countries, to talk about tourism into the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But it really is a part of our history, part of our heritage, and I think part of our future.
Niagara's legacy actually began in the Washington of 1812, less than a mile from here, as raucous debate pushed the country to war with Great Britain. At the time, Great Britain was locked in the Napoleonic Wars with France. In an attempt to restrict neutral trade with France, Britain often seized U.S. merchant ships. It also routinely searched vessels for Englishmen to conscript into the Royal Navy, impressing many American citizens as well. These actions enraged many. Among them, a group of congressmen who rose a cry for free trade and sailors' rights.
And over a period of years, those young Southern Western Democrats in Congress, who were collectively known as the War Hawks, just kept preaching more and more for war. They just weren't willing to sit back there and take all these slights against the United States. It was offensive to them. They didn't want to put up with it, and they said it's time to stop, and if we're going to put a stop to it, we're going to have to fight. And that's why we declared war.
The war was also fueled by American concern over British efforts to limit westward growth. Britain was trading arms with Native Americans in exchange for a lucrative fur trade in the Northwest Territories. An outraged John Quincy Adams charged it was absurd to condemn vast regions of territory to perpetual barrenness that a few hundred savages might find wild beasts to hunt upon it. The War Hawks in Congress also believed that Upper Canada was ripe for the taking since the majority of its settlers were American-born. While numerous factors contributed to the declaration of war, many believe the War of 1812 could have been avoided.
The peace treaty that ended the war didn't say a word about free trade and sailors' rights. The British Navy never gave an inch on the policy of impressment. The reason they stopped impressment was because after they defeated Napoleon, they downsized their fleet by 1/3 and were laying off all of their sailors and officers and had no more need for men. They had a tremendous surplus as of 1815. So I think if hostilities had been held off for even another year, there would have been no declaration of war.
Nonetheless, the war began with the first actions occurring on the upper Great Lakes. An ill-prepared American invasion of Canada was quickly repulsed. British troops and their Indian allies moved swiftly to capture American military forts at Mackinac, Dearborn, and Detroit, leaving the entire northwest frontier under England's control. Trails of fire explode and illuminate the Philadelphia skyline. Niagara joins the 4th of July celebration, marking America's independence from England in 1776. A few decades later, the War of 1812 would revive those cries for freedom against British tyranny. Many called it the Second War for Independence. Writing about the War of 1812, Max Rosenberg observed, "It made known to the world at large that the United States regarded herself as free and sovereign, and as a nation which must be treated and respected as such." It seems somehow fitting that the brig will spend the holiday weekend in this historic Pennsylvania city, the very birthplace of America, reacquainting visitors with their patriotic past. A day sail aboard Niagara gives the public a rare chance to learn about the operation of square-rigged vessels and to witness firsthand the excitement and skill of tall ship sailing. The ship's complement draws a striking contrast to the all-male fighting crews of yesteryear. Today, they're a fascinating blend of men and women who come from a multitude of backgrounds.
Mark, deadline.
Why they choose sailing as a profession is as unique as each individual on board.
What got me interested, I was sitting behind a desk in Philadelphia as an accountant, and I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. And I had been volunteering on weekends on a ship in Philadelphia, and so I was able to turn that into a full-time job.
Wooden ships on the water, very free and easy. Easy, you know the way it's supposed to be. Silver on the shoreline, let us be. Talking about very free and easy.
Wooden ships have an uncanny ability to conjure up images of adventure and romance on the high seas. While Niagara does afford its crew the thrill of travel, the adventure is tempered by the endless work.
People talk about, the romance of the sea and everything like that, but if you've been on board ship, then you would know, you lose the romance after the first year. It's just a job.
On any ship, privacy and space are at a premium, but none more so than on a sailing warship. It may be hard to imagine, but during the Battle of Lake Erie, 155 men endured almost unbearable conditions. Today, with a sailing crew of just 40, space remains a precious commodity. In such tight quarters, the ability to get along with shipmates is paramount.
When you work and live with people on such a close basis, you become so that you know them thoroughly. And I mean, you know them by their good points, and you know them by their less good points. And the camaraderie between the crew is just amazing. It's something you don't see a lot in modern society.
To keep pace with demanding schedules and increase safety, Niagara is equipped with 2 diesel engines and modern navigational and communication devices. But other than those few accommodations, ship life has changed little. Centuries ago, the success of sailing ships fell to the mercy of fair weather and favorable winds, and perhaps most importantly, the skill of their navigators. In 1812, one of the most renowned navigators on the Great Lakes was Erie merchant sailor Daniel Dobbins. It was Dobbins who carried word of the British capture of Mackinac and Detroit to Washington, D.C. Although President Madison understood the importance of naval superiority on the Great Lakes, it was Dobbins who convinced him that Erie was the most suitable place to build a fleet of warships. Erie offered a natural harbor and a sandbar at the entrance to Presque Isle Bay. These features prevented the British from gaining access to American ships during their construction. Impressed by his knowledge of the Great Lakes, President Madison appointed Dobbins a sailing master in the United States Navy and granted him a small sum to begin construction of a fleet.
Building a squadron of warships at Erie was indeed a remarkable feat because there was absolutely nothing at Erie, Pennsylvania to build ships with. I mean, 1812, Erie was a backwoods town of only 400 people, no industry whatsoever. Now, the only thing they had at Erie, Pennsylvania was wood. But to build a ship, you chop down a tree, you carve it up, and you let that wood cure for more than a year. But these men didn't have a year. So what was a live green tree in the morning might become part of a deck plank or a yardarm that very afternoon.
Other shipbuilding material came from distant cities. Anchors, shot, and rope from Pittsburgh. Sailcloth from Philadelphia. Cannons from Washington. All of these raw goods were transported over treacherous terrain during one of the worst winters in history.
One of the miracles of the Battle of Lake Erie is not the fact that the United States won this battle, but the fact that a squadron of 6 warships was built in the wilderness in a period of 8 months' time.
While the initial effort to build the fleet was initiated by Dobbins, Noah Brown, an experienced New York shipbuilder, was contracted in February 1813 to help complete the daunting task. The naval war on the lakes has often been called the Shipwrights' War, in that both sides were dependent on the skill and speed of the builders before any battles could be fought. Noah Brown summed it up best.
Though staunchly built, we want no extras. Plain work is all that is required. They will be wanted for only one battle. If we win, that is all that is wanted of them.
The American fleet was designed for the unique challenges of Erie's harbor. Melbourne Smith, noted ship designer and architect of today's Niagara, explains.
Erie Harbor was a challenge for shipbuilders back in 1812 because there was very little water over the bar. So any ship going into Erie Harbor had to be very shoal draft. And to get a large ship out like the Niagara and the Lawrence, they would have to lift the ships up over the bar. So the vessel had to be built very shoal draft and very beamy so she could work on Lake Erie.
Constitution, the party.
Port of call, Charleston Naval Yard, Boston, Massachusetts. Home to old Ironsides, the only existing vessel from the War of 1812. During the war, the USS Constitution's history touched the Niagara when a contingent of its battle-hardened crew joined the fleet in Erie. On this day, Niagara's path crosses with the Constitution's, once again for a moment of celebration. The vessels honor the nation with a 21-gun salute. The sound of the cannons remind us that while these ships are objects of great beauty, they were built as instruments of war. In the spring of 1813, Oliver Hazard Perry, a dashing, ambitious naval officer from Newport, Rhode Island, arrived in Erie to take command of the American fleet. The United States Navy was strictly a volunteer force. Perry had great difficulty recruiting experienced seamen to join his tiny wilderness fleet. Many volunteers were lured by the prospect of prize money, a common practice of rewarding the crew with a share in the value of captured ships. But on the Great Lakes, the odds of winning prize money were slim. In desperation, with the enemy drawing near, Perry sent urgent letters to the Secretary of the Navy, pleading for more men.
I cannot describe to you, sir, the mortification of my situation. I have not learned that any seamen have left Sackett's Harbor for this place. As soon as they arrive, we shall meet the enemy. He is now off the harbor with 6 sail. Very respectfully, O.H. Perry.
After endless pleas for help, Perry finally mustered a force of nearly 600 men, a hodgepodge of sailors, soldiers, Marines, and militia from virtually every state in the Union. Many were Pennsylvanians. Of the experienced seamen, up to 25% were African Americans. Seafaring was one of the few trades open to free blacks, and Newport, Rhode Island, from which many of Perry's crew hailed, was home to a large number of free blacks.
So in this battle, this fleet was crewed by a heterogeneous group of men probably never before nor since joined together to fight on a fleet of U.S. warships.
With 9 ships, Commodore Perry spent the last weeks of August 1813 blockading the British squadron at their base in Amherstburg at the western end of Lake Erie. Perry set up base at Put-in Bay, Ohio, prepared his men for battle, and watched for the British to emerge. But an unseen enemy was taking a toll on the American fleet: disease. Up to a quarter of Perry's men were violently ill, suffering from lake fever or dysentery. It was a malady that would plague them throughout the campaign. The commander of the British squadron, Robert Barclay, was facing his own dilemma: starvation. With his crews on half rations and little left, he knew he had to venture out into open waters and resupply across the lake.
So ready or not, their only chance to preserve the garrison, to resupply, would be to get past the American fleet. So the Battle of Lake Erie can be looked at as the day the hungry came out to fight the sick.
At dawn on September 10, 1813, Commodore Barclay's fleet was sighted approaching Put-in Bay. Within minutes, the U.S. fleet set sail to challenge them. Of the 9 American vessels, the sister ships Niagara and Lawrence were the largest. The Lawrence was Perry's flagship, named in honor of his close friend, Captain James Lawrence, who died in action only 3 months earlier. Moments before the engagement, Perry hoisted his personal flag, inscribed with Captain Lawrence's dying words, "Don't give up the ship." The deep blue flag was a gift to Perry, hand-stitched by the women of Erie to show their support. Near noon, under a blazing sun and in light wind, the agonizing silence was shattered when the British opened fire at long range. Perry ordered his squadron to close in, improving the reach of his heavier guns. The Niagara and smaller gunboats lagged behind, allowing the British to concentrate their fire on the Lawrence. Early on, Perry's flagship sustained heavy damage. 80% of Lawrence's crew were killed or wounded. In a final, desperate attempt for victory, Perry transferred his command to the undamaged Niagara and swiftly broke through the enemy line. Musket and cannon fire echoed across the lake, a cacophony of destruction. Within minutes, the thundering guns fell silent. The British surrendered. A short time later, Perry inscribed his legendary but brief report to General William Henry Harrison.
Dear General, we have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop. Yours with great respect and esteem, O.H. Perry.
For 300 years, the British Navy had dominated the oceans of the world. They had defeated the Dutch Navy, Spanish navies, French navies, Swedish navies, Russian navies. The British had defeated everybody. And here it was, the first time in their history, and one of the few times in their history, they lost an entire squadron. And it occurred on a freshwater lake 500 miles from the nearest salt water by a fleet built out of Greenwood in less than 6 months' time. A tremendous humiliation to the Royal Navy, a tremendous boost to the United States.
After the battle, the surgeon from the Lawrence, Usher Parsons, tended to the wounded and began the daunting task of recording the names of the deceased. The survivors buried the dead. Enlisted men were interred at sea that night, and the officers from both sides were buried together at Put-in Bay the next day. The victory gave the United States complete control of Lake Erie and forced the British to retreat. But, more importantly, it raised the morale of an entire nation. The war raged on for another 15 months, finally drawing to an end when the Treaty of Ghent was signed on Christmas Eve, 1814. The victory on Lake Erie allowed the United States to secure her Northwest territories and reopen supply lines to the frontier. The complete responsibility for a ship at sea falls into the capable hands of her captain. The success of Niagara's sailing program today is due, in no small part, to the skilled leadership of Captain Walter Ribka. He has been both student and teacher of traditional and modern sailing techniques and customs, following a lifelong dedication to maritime history. For this captain, there is no greater pleasure than passing on the time-honored traditions of square-rig sailing.
What I find most satisfying is a slow and gradual process of seeing the crew come together, of seeing green hands come to the ship and know very little, and over the course of time start learning their way around the ship, become sure-footed in the rig, become knowledgeable hands. Seeing the performance of the ship improve as the whole crew comes together.
During the War of 1812, Oliver Hazard Perry was frustrated by the lack of skilled seamen. An odd collection of sailors, soldiers, and frontiersmen had to be molded into a combat-ready force in only a few weeks. Niagara's sailing program faces some of the same challenges today. With a constant flow of volunteers, some that sign aboard for only 3 weeks, the captain must rely on a small corps of experienced crew to train the novice sailor. Arthur Kimberly has sailed more nautical miles than any crew member. He stepped aboard his first ship in 1939. Green hands have much to learn from this modest, gentle man.
I'm just the sailmaker. I work on the sails and covers and various items like that. And what teaching I can do on the side to the young people is maybe the best thing I can do. Teaching them little things of ropes and wires and things.
Niagara offers volunteers a rare opportunity to participate in the time-honored traditions of our nautical heritage. The rewards of sailing this majestic wooden ship are certain to last a lifetime.
Most of my best memories revolve around sailing and just being out in the ocean, sunsets, moonsets. I mean, you see like every celestial thing happen because you're up at all different hours of the day and night. So you see some really beautiful things.
All that's required of a volunteer on Niagara is a willingness to learn, an ability to get along with others, and reasonably good health. And attitude counts, like a willingness to accept whatever comes your way, whether it's pleasure or hardship.
You really have to live on a ship to really understand what it's like. You just can't read about it because there is a lot of drudgery involved. There's moments where you hate it, and then there are moments where you think it's the best thing in the world. So it's just a mixture of those. And one thing I realized is it's not a yacht at all. It's not a pleasure yacht. It's a real working square rig vessel. So it's really unique in that respect.
Nestled in New England, amidst clapboard houses steeped in history and stark white sails gliding on sparkling waters, the sailing capital of the East Coast. Hometown of Oliver Hazard Perry and his final resting place. Newport, Rhode Island, a town rich in history and dedicated to the heritage and art of sailing. Niagara berths at historic Bowen's Wharf. Centuries before, this vacation seaport played host to hundreds of merchant tall ships from around the world. On any day, the trade here even rivaled the more famous ports of New York and Boston. Today, the towering presence of Niagara is a magnet for crowds of curious onlookers. As Pennsylvania's goodwill ambassador, Niagara promotes the Commonwealth and its rich past to the hundreds of thousands who board her each year. Visitors can learn about the War of 1812, the Battle of Lake Erie, and the operation of square rig vessels.
This is my first time in Newport. I'm from Los Angeles. I came out to visit my boyfriend and we decided to take a weekend stroll. And came by here, they have all these billboards up with all the historical information about this ship, and it looked really interesting. And then we found we could go on the ship and take a look around. It's amazing. They actually have a lot of people who are, I guess, living on the ship right now, and they're giving tours and they're talking about what it's like to actually travel with the ship.
When in port, demands on the crew are less rigorous, but there are still daily maintenance schedules to keep, tours to give, and the endless preparation of meals. There's also an opportunity to relax, explore new places, and take part in onboard festivities frequently sponsored by the host city. In the 1800s, time to relax was scant, but every now and then the melodic sound of traditional songs called sea shanties filled the air.
So swiftly run to prove to France Columbia's sons are brave Yankee boys.
It's late summer, and Niagara sets sail once again. With a warm, gentle breeze behind her, she's enveloped by a spectacular sunset. Quietly sailing through Vineyard Sound and into the tiny port of Woods Hole, Massachusetts. In the early 19th century, Woods Hole was a maritime center for lumber, salt, glass, and whale oil. But even this tiny hamlet couldn't escape the terrors of war entirely. Once during the War of 1812, a lone British warship bombarded Woods Hole, turning its quiet streets into an impact zone. On the northwest front, Niagara survived the British cannons pointed her way, but failed to survive the peace that followed. After the War of 1812, Niagara and the Lawrence were unceremoniously scuttled in Misery Bay at Presque Isle. In 1875, the Lawrence was raised from her shallow water grave, but she would meet a sad end soon after. Sent to a warehouse in Philadelphia for an exposition celebrating the nation's centennial, she was lost in a devastating fire. "38 years later, an enthusiastic group of citizens from Erie, Pennsylvania, formed a Centennial Commission to commemorate Niagara's victory. The second brig, Niagara, was raised from Misery Bay, and a new ship was constructed on its original keel and bottom timbers. On the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Lake Erie, the reconstructed Niagara was celebrated with patriotic pomp and pageantry. She was then towed to several Great Lake ports by the USS Wolverine, the nation's first iron warship, built in 1844. Her last port of call was Put-in Bay, Ohio, site of the famous battle. Later, she returned to Erie and was placed on permanent display. Time and weather took a toll on Niagara. But in 1931, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania stepped in, took possession of the decaying ship, and began a second reconstruction. The onset of the Great Depression, however, brought work to a standstill. Her hull was finally completed in 1943, her rigging in 1963. Niagara was mounted in a concrete cradle and opened for public visitation. But Niagara's sad tale of neglect was not over. By the mid-1980s, the elements once again battered the great ship. Niagara was closed to the public, a victim of severe deterioration.
When she was in her cradle at the foot of State Street, I remember vividly taking our oldest son and all of his friends on his birthday to the Niagara. I was aghast by two things. First, only one little boy out of the whole crowd of 15 had ever been there. And number two, these little boys, as they were playing on the Niagara and trying to be very respectful, were coming across dry rot that was truly dangerous. And so it was really at that time I said, I want to work for the Niagara because of the children, because of the future, because of what Niagara can be, but was not at that time.
Echoing the enthusiasm of the Centennial Commission 7 decades before, the citizens of Erie rallied to help with restoration efforts. A public-private partnership emerged between the newly formed Niagara League and the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission.
One of the first things we wanted to do was to not only see the ship repaired in its deteriorating condition, but we also wanted to see it refloated. And at that time, we were kind of a lone voice in the wilderness calling out to see that done, but we persisted. We worked with local representatives. We worked with some of the people who had influence and whatnot in the local community, and we also began to work with the PHMC, and the dream became infectious about seeing the ship refloated.
Under the skilled direction of noted ship designer Melbourne Smith, the vision of a seaworthy Niagara came to life in painstaking accuracy and detail.
The first challenge was to find out exactly what the original ship was. Unfortunately, there were photographs from the original ship when she was brought up in 1912 for the centennial. And by studying those photographs and then knowing what the original measurements were for the vessel, we had those. It was just a matter of drawing it up so it could be built. Now we know the original ship was built out of very green wood and very poorly constructed because she was only built for one battle. But this vessel, we wanted to make her exactly the same way, but use better woods, better design, so she would last for a long, long time.
With dignity and honor befitting its proud past, Niagara was launched in Erie on September 10th, 1988. The ceremony marked the 175th anniversary of the Battle of Lake Erie and the peace between Britain and the United States. For the state of Pennsylvania and the citizens of Erie, it was a long-sought dream come true.
It was perfect conditions, clear sky, blue sky, sun dancing on the water. The Erieites and everyone from the surrounding area who came to watch the launching really added the excitement to the air. People had the feeling that this was a moment in history, that they were witnessing really a new period of time in the life of the Niagara.
By virtue of the authority vested in me by the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and other laws, now proclaim that on this date, the United States Brig Niagara shall be placed in the commission as the flagship of Pennsylvania in Erie, and shall be the responsibility of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission according to law and this order.
In 1990, the US Brig Niagara was commissioned the official flagship of Pennsylvania.
It was the official pomp and circumstance that the Brig Niagara deserved. We had all of the officials, we had the Navy League and everyone in uniform, we had the Niagara League, all dressed in their special outfits and uniforms, and we had an air of importance that the commissioning bestowed on the ship because she was officially the United States Brig Niagara once again.
As summer wanes, Niagara embarks on the final leg of her journey home. Northward through the Atlantic she sails, before heading south into the St. Lawrence Seaway. Her path strikes a wake across Lake Ontario, and finally, on a warm morning in late August, Niagara enters the Welland Locks in Canada. The locks are a series of concrete chambers placed in a canal running parallel to the Niagara River. Massive steel gates harness the water. As Niagara enters each lock, the gates are secured. The lock fills with water and raises the ship to the next level. This series of 8 locks creates a virtual stairway, enabling ships to complete an astounding climb equivalent to the height of Niagara Falls. Slowly, with tedious precision, Niagara rises for nearly 10 hours before reaching the end of her passage. The Welland Lock system did not exist in 1813. Vessels had no way of traveling freely from Lake Ontario to Lake Erie, which limited the movement of goods and commerce. Emerging from the locks, Niagara docks at Port Colborne on the northern shore of Lake Erie. A small group gathers on the deck at sunrise. It's a time of reflection before the last run of the journey home. Under full sail once more, Niagara almost seems to glide across Lake Erie. It's a perfect day for a voyage. In the words of author R.H. Dana, this is the pleasure of life at sea. Fine weather, day after day, without interruption. Fair wind, and plenty of it. And homeward bound. As the summer days melt into fall, Niagara's cruise comes full circle as she is welcomed with open arms into her home port of Erie.
Good morning, Erie. What a wonderful day. Michelle, Leslie, Tom, and I are very happy to be here. Always happy to be home and to welcome one of the most important members of the Erie community back home, the Brig Niagara.
This striking flagship is the centerpiece of Erie's bayfront renaissance. She berths at the new Erie Maritime Museum, creating a spectacular image through the grand window overlooking Presque Isle Bay. In the distance, a monument erected in honor of Oliver Hazard Perry, a stark reminder of Niagara's gallant legacy and honor. She is a source of great pride to the entire Commonwealth and an icon entwined in the culture, traditions, and people of Erie. The future of Niagara lies on solid ground with the dedication of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission behind her, and the support of the flagship Niagara League.
Niagara's future will involve at least three components. First, we will continue to preserve the history of the ship and the story of the Battle of Lake Erie. It is one of the great American history stories, and it is a story of enduring value and interest and significance. We will also, through our sailing program, preserve the history of tall sailing ships, and we are one of the few fully operational vessels in the country, and one of the few that has a connection to an event in American history that is now under sail. And then the third part of our mission in the future will involve an extensive partnership with public and private organizations, starting with the flagship Niagara League, but also including state and city and even federal agencies that will participate in that effort.
Niagara sails as a living symbol of American naval history. bringing her message of goodwill to ports along the East Coast and Great Lakes. She makes tangible the deeds of those who sacrificed their lives so that a young nation could grow and prosper. She is a treasure of the Commonwealth and a tribute to those free spirits who keep alive the traditions and mystique of great wooden ships in the days of sail.